Picture this. It's the year 1350, and you're standing in the middle of Cairo on a scorching summer day. The sun's beating down like a furnace, dust is coating everything in sight, and you're surrounded by nearly 500,000 people, making this one of the largest cities on Earth. But here's the crazy part. You're in the middle of a desert, hundreds of miles from the nearest mountain spring or natural water source. So how exactly does a medieval megacity survive when every drop of water has to come from one place? The Nile River flowing past the city walls. This isn't just a story about staying hydrated. This is about one of history's most ingenious urban systems, where Islamic law, medieval engineering, and pure human necessity created a water network so sophisticated it kept Cairo alive for centuries. We're talking about a city that figured out how to lift millions of gallons from the river, distribute it through underground channels, and serve it free to anyone who needed it, all funded by a charity system that would make modern non-profits jealous. Today, we're following one summer day through medieval Cairo's water network. From the crack of dawn, when officials measured the Nile's mood, to the late-night maintenance crews keeping the whole system running. You'll see how ox-powered machines lifted water up to mountain fortresses, how marble fountains served ice-cold drinks on every street corner, and how legal documents from 1,000 years ago created the world's first public utility company. But first, we need to understand the stakes. Cairo wasn't built next to a convenient lake or blessed with mountain streams. It sat in one of the world's most unforgiving environments, hot, dry, and completely dependent on that muddy river for survival. No Nile flow meant no city. It's that simple. And every single person living there, from the sultan in his palace to the street vendor hawking bread, knew their lives depended on an intricate dance between nature, technology, and human organization. The story starts before sunrise, when the most important person in Cairo wasn't the ruler or the richest merchant. It was the guy with the measuring stick down at the Nilometer. Dawn breaks over Rhoda Island, and there's already a small crowd gathering around what looks like a glorified well. But this isn't just any hole in the ground. This is the Rhoda Nilometer, basically medieval Cairo's version of a stock market ticker, weather station, and emergency alert system all rolled into one. The stone structure sits right in the Nile, connected to the river by channels that let the water flow in and out naturally. And that guy with the measuring rod, he's about to deliver news that could make or break the entire city's year. See, the Nile wasn't like your typical river that flows at a steady pace year-round. Every summer, monsoon rains from deep in Africa would send a massive flood surging north, turning the river from a lazy brown stream into a raging torrent that could rise 20 feet or more. This annual flood, called the inundation, was literally life or death for Egypt. Too little water meant drought, famine, and social chaos. Too much meant destroyed villages and ruined crops. But just the right amount, that meant prosperity, full granaries, and another year of survival for the greatest city in the Islamic world. The Nilometer readings weren't just academic curiosities, they drove real policy decisions that affected everyone. When the morning measurement showed the flood was running low, tax collectors would start preparing for lean times ahead. Canal operators would begin calculating which waterways to open first, and which neighborhoods might have to wait. Merchants would start hoarding grain, knowing prices were about to skyrocket. It was like having tomorrow's newspaper today, except instead of sports scores and weather forecasts, you got early warnings about potential economic disaster. But here's what made the Nilometer truly brilliant. It wasn't just measuring water levels. The stone structure was carved with graduation marks that corresponded to different flood stages, each with its own meaning. 16 cubits meant perfect conditions, celebration time. 14 cubits meant trouble ahead, time to start rationing. 18 cubits meant grab everything that wasn't nailed down and head for higher ground. These weren't arbitrary numbers either. They were based on centuries of careful observation, passed down through generations of engineers who understood exactly how the river behaved. The readings got announced throughout the city with a ritual that was part town crier, part religious ceremony. Officials would call out the measurements from mosque minarets, and the news would spread through the markets faster than gossip at a wedding. Everyone knew what those numbers meant for their daily lives. Bakers calculating flour prices, farmers deciding which fields to plant, and families budgeting their household expenses all depended on that morning announcement from the Nilometer. Once the city knew what kind of year they were facing, the real work began. Because measuring the Nile was just the first step. Getting that water from the river to the people required an army of workers, animals, and machines working in perfect coordination. All along the canals that branched off from the main river, teams of workers were already preparing for another day of the most important job in medieval Cairo, lifting water up from where nature put it to where people actually needed it. And trust me, this wasn't as simple as turning on a faucet. Every drop that made it into the city required serious mechanical muscle and a whole lot of coordinated effort. The stars of this operation were machines called saqiyas, basically giant wooden wheels covered in clay pots, powered by oxen walking in endless circles. Picture a Ferris wheel designed by someone who'd never heard of fun, and you're getting close. These contraptions were engineering marvels that could lift thousands of gallons per day, but they required constant attention from teams of workers who knew every squeak, groan, and rhythm of their particular machine. Each saqiya was like a small factory operation. You had the ox driver, whose job was keeping the animal moving at exactly the right pace. Too fast, and the pots would spill. Too slow, and you'd never meet the day's water quota. Then there was the pot inspector, constantly checking for cracks or clogs that could shut down the whole system. The gear maintenance crew kept the wooden mechanisms greased and aligned, because one broken tooth meant hours of expensive repairs. And the channel director made sure water flowed to the right places at the right times, balancing the needs of different neighborhoods like a medieval traffic controller. But saqiyas weren't the only lifting game in town. Scattered throughout the canal network were simpler devices called shadufs, basically giant seesaws with buckets on one end and counterweights on the other. One person could operate a shaduf, making them perfect for smaller operations or places where you couldn't afford to keep a whole ox and wheel operation running. The operator would dip the bucket into the canal, then use the counterweight to swing it up and dump the water into irrigation channels or storage cisterns. It looked like a graceful dance when done by someone who'd been working the same shaduf for years. These machines fed water into a network of cisterns, gardens, public baths, and workshops that formed the backbone of Cairo's economy. The cisterns were particularly crucial, underground chambers lined with waterproof plaster that could store thousands of gallons for weeks at a time. During high Nile years, they'd fill these cisterns to capacity, creating a buffer against the inevitable dry months. Smart building designers incorporated cistern space into their plans from the beginning, treating water storage like we treat electrical systems today, essential infrastructure that had to be built right the first time. The bathhouses were major water consumers that employed dozens of people and served hundreds of customers daily. These weren't just places to get clean, they were social centers where deals got made, news got shared, and relationships got formed. A typical bathhouse might go through 1,000 gallons in a busy day, all of it heated by wood-fired systems that required their own supply chains and maintenance crews. Meanwhile, workshops throughout the city depended on steady water supplies for everything from textile dyeing to metalworking. Leather tanners needed vast amounts of water for processing hides. Potters required specific water qualities for their glazes and clay preparation. Even bakeries used significant water for their operations, from mixing dough to cleaning equipment. Each industry had developed its own relationships with water suppliers and its own techniques for managing this precious resource. But all this lifting and distributing was just the foundation for Cairo's most ambitious water project. an engineering feat that carried Nile water up to the highest points in the city, defying gravity through medieval mechanical genius. The Citadel of Saladin dominated Cairo's skyline like a stone mountain, housing the Sultan's palace, military barracks, and government offices hundreds of feet above the Nile. Getting water up there should have been impossible with medieval technology, but Muslim engineers had figured out a solution that would have impressed Roman architects. An aqueduct system that used river-powered wheels to push water uphill through enclosed channels. At the base of the system, massive water wheels, much larger than the saqqiyas used for irrigation, worked day and night to capture the river's flow and convert it into lifting power. These wheels were engineering masterpieces, some more than 50 feet in diameter, built from specially selected timber and maintained by crews who understood every joint and bearing. The sound of these giant wheels turning became part of Cairo's daily soundtrack, a constant groaning and splashing that meant the city's lifeline was working properly. Water lifted by the wheels flowed into covered channels that snaked their way up toward the Citadel, following carefully surveyed routes that maintained just the right slope to keep the flow moving without losing too much to evaporation or leaks. The channels themselves were marvels of construction, stone-lined passages with removable covers that allowed maintenance crews to clean out sediment and repair damage without shutting down the entire system. The aqueduct didn't just serve the Citadel, it fed water to several neighborhoods along its route, creating some of the most desirable real estate in medieval Cairo. Having aqueduct access meant reliable water pressure, which meant you could afford luxuries like private fountains, garden pools, and elaborate bath facilities. Property values along the aqueduct route reflected this advantage, with houses and commercial buildings commanding premium prices. But here's what made this system truly remarkable. It was designed with redundancy built in. Multiple wheels fed the same channels, so maintenance on one unit wouldn't shut down the water supply to the Citadel. Backup channels provided alternative routes when the main lines needed repairs. Storage cisterns at various points along the system could provide water for several days if the wheels stopped working entirely. The engineers who designed this system understood that failure wasn't just inconvenient. It could trigger political crises if the Sultan's palace ran dry during important negotiations or military campaigns. The Mamluk rulers who rebuilt and expanded the aqueduct system in the 13th century turned water infrastructure into a statement of political power. Having the engineering skills to make water flow uphill demonstrated mastery over nature itself. Foreign dignitaries visiting the Citadel would see water flowing from marble fountains hundreds of feet above the Nile and understand that they were dealing with a civilization that could accomplish the impossible. Yet for all its impressive engineering, the aqueduct served only a tiny fraction of Cairo's population. The real heroes of the city's water system were much smaller, much simpler, and much more numerous. The neighborhood sabils that made sure everyone, rich or poor, could get a drink of clean water. Walk down any street in medieval Cairo, and you'd find them on practically every corner. Small, elegant buildings that looked like tiny palaces, but served the most basic human need. These were sabils, public water fountains that dispensed free, ice-cold drinks to anyone who walked up and asked. And when I say anyone, I mean anyone. Rich merchant, poor beggar, foreign visitor, local resident, the sabils didn't discriminate. They were like medieval vending machines, except instead of coins, they ran on something much more interesting: charity. But don't picture some simple water spout sticking out of a wall. These sabils were architectural masterpieces that would put most modern public facilities to shame. The typical sabil was a 2-story building with the water fountain on the ground floor and a Quran school, called a kutab, on the 2nd floor. The whole structure was built from the finest materials the donors could afford: marble floors, intricate woodwork, brass fittings, and decorative tiles that caught the light like jewels. The heart of each sabil was its cistern, a carefully engineered underground chamber that could hold thousands of gallons of water. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were sophisticated storage systems with multiple chambers, settling areas where sediment could drop out, and channels that allowed fresh water to flow in while older water flowed out. The cistern walls were lined with special plaster that kept the water cool even during the hottest summer days, creating a natural refrigeration system that made sabil water genuinely refreshing. Above the cistern, the public area was designed like a stage for a very specific performance. Marble basins lined the walls, each one fed by brass spouts that could be opened and closed by the sabil attendants. The water flowed constantly during operating hours, creating a pleasant splashing sound that could be heard from the street, basically medieval advertising that said, "Cold water here." Beautiful brass grills separated the attendants from the public, both for security and to maintain the dignity of the charitable act. The attendants themselves were crucial to the whole operation. These weren't just random guys handing out water. They were trained professionals who understood hygiene, crowd control, and customer service. They knew how to manage the morning rush when everyone wanted water before heading to work, how to handle the midday crowds during the hottest part of the day, and how to deal with the evening surge when people were heading home. They kept the brass cups clean, monitored the water quality, and made sure the cistern levels stayed adequate throughout the day. But here's where it gets really interesting. Every one of these sabils was privately funded through a legal system that was basically the medieval equivalent of setting up a non-profit organization. Wealthy Cairo residents would establish what's called a waqf, a charitable endowment that generated income specifically to fund public services. And the paperwork for these waqfs reads like the most detailed business plans you've ever seen. Open up a waqfiyya document from a medieval Cairo sabil, and you'll find line items that would make a modern accountant weep with joy. There's the sabil keeper's monthly salary, usually enough to support a middle-class family. The daily allowance for lamp oil to keep the facility lit during evening hours. Money for soap and cleaning supplies to maintain the marble surfaces and brass fittings. Funds for repairs and maintenance, calculated down to the cost of replacing individual roof tiles. Even the salaries for the Quran teachers working in the school upstairs were spelled out in precise detail. The funding came from shops, houses, and commercial buildings that the waqf owned and rented out. A typical sabil waqf might own a dozen shops in the local market, a couple of residential buildings, and maybe a workshop or two. The rental income from these properties flowed into a dedicated fund that could only be used for the sabil's operations. It was like having a trust fund specifically designed to keep water flowing to the public forever. What made this system truly brilliant was how it aligned self-interest with public good. The person establishing the waqf got social prestige, religious merit, and their name carved in marble for posterity. The neighborhood got a reliable source of clean water and a school for their children. The economy got a boost from all the construction, maintenance, and staffing jobs. And the city government got essential public services without having to pay for them out of taxes. Some waqfs were established by sultans and high officials who wanted to make grand statements about their generosity. Others were funded by successful merchants who'd made their fortunes in trade and wanted to give something back to the community. A few were even established by groups of neighbors who pooled their resources to fund a sabil for their own street. The system was flexible enough to work at any scale, from palace-sized monuments to simple neighborhood fountains. But the sabils were just part of Cairo's water delivery network. For people who wanted water brought directly to their homes and businesses, there was another option. One that involved a lot more walking and a lot more personal service. The Saqqa water carriers were the unsung heroes of medieval Cairo's hydration system, hauling fresh water door to door in leather bags that could hold up to 20 gallons each. These guys were basically the Uber Eats of medieval water delivery, except instead of bringing you dinner, they brought you the stuff you needed to stay alive. And let me tell you, carrying 20 gallons of water through Cairo's narrow streets in 100-degree heat was not a job for the weak. Each Saqqa had his own route through the city, developed over years of building relationships with regular customers. They knew which households needed water on which days, which businesses went through the most water during busy periods, and which customers paid on time versus which ones you had to chase for payment. The successful Saqqa carriers were part deliveryman, part accountant, and part neighborhood gossip network. They knew everyone's business because they literally kept everyone's business running. The leather bags they used, called mashk, were works of art in their own right, made from goatskin that had been treated with special techniques to make it waterproof. These bags could last for years if properly maintained. The leather had to be flexible enough to carry comfortably, but strong enough not to burst under the weight of all that water. A good mashk bag was a Saqqa's most valuable possession, and many carriers developed personal relationships with specific leather workers who understood exactly how they liked their equipment prepared. The routes these water carriers followed were carefully planned to maximize efficiency while maintaining service quality. A typical Saqqa might start his day at dawn, filling up at one of the major cisterns or directly from a canal-side saqiya. Then he'd work his way through his route, starting with the customers who needed water for morning activities, bakers who needed to mix dough, workshops that required water for their operations, and wealthy households that expected fresh water for their morning routines. Midday brought the heaviest demand as temperatures soared, and everyone needed more water for drinking, cooking, and staying cool. The smart Saqqa carriers had worked out deals with sabils along their routes where they could refill their bags without having to trek all the way back to the main water sources. This created a whole secondary economy of water trading, with sabil attendants selling bulk water to carriers who would then distribute it to individual customers. The pricing system was surprisingly sophisticated. Water delivered to ground floor customers cost less than water carried up multiple flights of stairs. Regular customers who ordered the same amount on predictable schedules got better rates than one-off deliveries. Water delivered during peak demand hours, the hottest part of the day, commanded premium prices. Some Saqqa carriers even offered subscription services, guaranteeing daily delivery for a monthly fee. But the job wasn't just about carrying heavy loads and collecting payments. These water carriers had to be experts in quality control, able to tell good water from bad just by looking at it, smelling it, and sometimes even tasting it. They knew which sources produced the clearest water, which cisterns had the best filtration systems, and which suppliers cut corners that could make customers sick. The leather bags themselves required constant maintenance. Saqqa carriers would spend their evenings cleaning the interior with special brushes, treating the leather with oils that kept it supple, and checking for tiny leaks that could waste precious water during the next day's deliveries. A well-maintained mashk bag would develop a distinctive smell and taste that regular customers actually came to prefer. It was like the medieval equivalent of preferring your coffee from a specific shop. Competition between water carriers was fierce but usually friendly. They'd share information about water quality, warn each other about customers who didn't pay, and sometimes help out when someone got sick or injured. The successful carriers built reputations for reliability and honesty that allowed them to charge premium prices and attract the best customers. Yet all this careful delivery and distribution was only as good as the water quality control systems that made sure every drop reaching customers was safe to drink. Water quality in medieval Cairo wasn't something people took lightly, not when bad water could kill you faster than a sword fight. Every step from the Nile to your cup involved someone whose job was making sure you didn't end up doubled over with stomach cramps or worse. These weren't just casual checks either. The city had developed a whole science around keeping water clean that would impress modern health inspectors. The process started with something called settling jars, large clay vessels where freshly drawn Nile water would sit for hours while the heavy particles dropped to the bottom. Think of it like letting muddy puddle water clear up, except this was a carefully timed operation that required real skill to get right. The water handlers knew exactly how long different types of river water needed to settle based on the season, the flood levels, and even what the weather had been like upstream. After settling came filtration, and medieval Cairenes had figured out some pretty clever techniques. They'd layer clean sand, crushed charcoal, and pieces of cloth in specially designed vessels, creating filters that could turn murky river water into something crystal clear. The sand caught the visible particles, the charcoal absorbed smells and tastes, and the cloth provided the final polish. Some of the fancier operations even used multiple stages of filtration, passing water through several different setups to get it absolutely pristine. But here's where it gets really interesting. They understood that clean water could become contaminated after filtration if you weren't careful about storage and handling. Every container used for clean water had to be covered to keep dust, insects, and bird droppings out. The covers weren't just random pieces of cloth either. They were specially woven materials that allowed air circulation while blocking contaminants. The rotation rules were like a medieval version of first-in, first-out inventory management. Water that had been stored longest got used first, preventing any buildup of stagnation or bacterial growth. The people running cisterns and storage facilities kept careful track of when each batch of water arrived and made sure nothing sat around too long. Some facilities even had separate chambers for different batches, allowing them to rotate stock without mixing fresh water with older supplies. Temperature control was another crucial factor that medieval water managers understood better than you might expect. They knew that keeping water cool didn't just make it more refreshing, it actually kept it safer to drink. The underground cisterns weren't just convenient storage. They were sophisticated cooling systems that maintained steady temperatures even during the hottest summer days. The thick stone walls and underground placement created natural insulation that could keep water 20 degrees cooler than the outside air. Shade was equally important for any water storage above ground. You'd see elaborate awnings and covers protecting water jars and temporary storage areas from direct sunlight. The clay vessels themselves were often specially designed with thick walls and narrow openings that minimized heat absorption and evaporation. Some water cellars even developed portable shade systems. They could set up at different locations throughout their routes. The quality control system included regular inspections by officials who had the authority to shut down any operation that wasn't meeting standards. These inspectors weren't just checking for obvious problems like dirty containers or cloudy water. They were trained to spot subtle signs of contamination that could indicate deeper issues with a facility's operations. A sable attendant who consistently served water that looked clear but had an odd taste could find himself out of a job faster than you could say stomach illness. Fines for serving contaminated water were serious business, sometimes equivalent to several months' wages. The penalties weren't just about punishment. They were designed to make sure everyone in the water business understood that cutting corners could literally kill people. There are records of water suppliers being banned from the trade entirely for repeated violations, creating a powerful incentive to maintain high standards. The most successful operations developed their own quality testing procedures that went beyond the official requirements. Some sabil keepers would taste every batch of water before serving it to the public. Others developed relationships with trusted customers who would provide feedback about water quality and report any problems immediately. The best water carriers built reputations for quality that allowed them to charge premium prices because customers knew they could trust the product. But even the most sophisticated quality control system faced its biggest challenges during the times when demand spiked beyond normal capacity. And that's when Cairo's water network really showed what it was made of. Peak demand hit Cairo like a tidal wave during certain times of the year, and the entire water system had to shift into crisis mode to keep everyone hydrated. Religious festivals brought thousands of pilgrims streaming into the city, each one needing water for drinking, washing, and religious rituals. Merchant caravans arriving from months-long desert journeys would descend on the sabils like locusts, desperately trying to rehydrate after weeks of rationed water supplies. During Ramadan, the evening meal breaking the fast created a massive spike in water consumption as everyone tried to rehydrate at the same time. The sabils would see lines stretching around city blocks, with attendants working frantically to keep the brass cups clean and the water flowing. Some of the larger sabils had to implement informal rationing systems, limiting each person to a specific amount to make sure there was enough for everyone. Low-Nile years created the most serious challenges, turning water from a daily necessity into a precious commodity that required careful management. When the annual flood failed to reach adequate levels, the entire city had to adapt to scarcity conditions that tested every part of the distribution system. The saqiya operators would have to work longer hours with less water available, meaning each gallon lifted from the canals became more valuable. During these crisis periods, the sabils became the true safety net for Cairo's population. The waqf endowments that funded them included emergency provisions for exactly these situations. Extra funds that could be used to purchase water from private sources when the normal supplies ran short. Some waqf documents specified that during water shortages, the sabils should remain open even if it meant operating at a loss, because their primary mission was keeping people alive, not turning a profit. The Saqqa water carriers saw their prices skyrocket during shortages, but they also faced the challenge of finding enough water to meet demand. Some carriers would wake up before dawn to secure their daily supply from the most reliable sources, knowing that latecomers might find the best cisterns already drained. The competition could get fierce, but there were also examples of carriers pooling their resources and sharing reliable water sources to make sure everyone could stay in business. High Nile years brought different but equally serious challenges. When the annual flood came in stronger than expected, it could damage the canal systems and even contaminate water supplies with debris from upstream flooding. The excess water might sound like a good problem to have, but it often meant that established water sources became unusable just when people expected them to be most abundant. Canal closures during flood years could shut down entire neighborhoods' water supplies overnight. The saqiya wheels that normally lifted water from the canals would be submerged or damaged by debris carried in the flood waters. Repair crews would work around the clock to get the lifting systems back online, but sometimes whole districts had to rely entirely on stored water and emergency supplies until normal operations could resume. The aqueduct system to the Citadel had its own flood protocols that involved closing intake valves and switching to backup water sources when the main channels became contaminated with flood debris. The engineers who maintained these systems had developed detailed emergency procedures that could keep water flowing to the most critical locations, even when major parts of the network were offline. Price spikes during both shortage and flood years were managed through a combination of market forces and government intervention. The authorities understood that water prices couldn't be allowed to rise without limits, because that would mean poor people dying of thirst while rich people filled their private cisterns. Emergency waqf funds were specifically designated for purchasing water at inflated prices and distributing it through the sabils at no cost to users. Some of the most interesting crisis management happened at the neighborhood level, where communities would organize their own emergency water sharing systems. Wealthy households with private cisterns might open them to neighbors during shortages, while local merchants would contribute funds to keep the neighborhood's sabil operating during difficult times. These informal networks often proved more effective than top-down emergency management because they were based on long-term relationships and local knowledge. The record-keeping during crisis periods was incredibly detailed, with administrators tracking water consumption, supply levels, and distribution patterns to help plan for future emergencies. These records show that medieval Cairo's water managers understood the importance of data-driven decision-making, using historical patterns to predict when and where shortages were most likely to occur. But all these daytime activities, the measuring, lifting, distributing, and crisis management, were just the visible part of Cairo's water system. The real magic happened after dark, when maintenance crews worked through the night to keep everything running smoothly for the next day. As evening fell over medieval Cairo and most people settled in for the night, a different workforce took over the city's water infrastructure. These were the night shift crews who understood that keeping water flowing required constant vigilance and maintenance that never really stopped. While the daytime operations focused on moving water and serving customers, the nighttime work was all about prevention, repair, and preparation for the next day's demands. The sabil maintenance crews had a detailed checklist that would put modern facilities managers to shame. First came the cistern checks, lowering lanterns into the underground chambers to inspect water levels, look for signs of contamination, and check the condition of the filtering systems. They'd test the water quality by smell and appearance, looking for any changes that might indicate problems with the supply sources or storage systems. The brass fittings and spouts required nightly cleaning and polishing to prevent the buildup of mineral deposits that could clog the flow or contaminate the water. This wasn't just about appearance, though the gleaming brass certainly added to the sabils' impressive visual impact. Mineral buildup could create breeding grounds for harmful bacteria, and corroded fittings could leak precious water or introduce metallic tastes that would drive customers away. The marble surfaces got scrubbed down with special cleaning solutions made from vinegar and salt, removing the day's accumulation of dust, spillage, and hand marks from hundreds of users. The cleaning crews knew exactly which areas saw the heaviest use and required the most attention, developing efficient routines that could get everything spotless in minimum time. Meanwhile, out along the canal networks, the saqiya maintenance teams were performing their own crucial nighttime rituals. The wooden gears that transferred power from the oxen to the lifting wheels needed regular applications of animal fat to prevent the constant friction from wearing them down. A seized gear could shut down an entire lifting station for days while replacement parts were carved and fitted. The clay pots attached to the lifting chains required constant inspection and replacement. Even small cracks could cause significant water loss during the lifting process, and a pot that broke completely could jam the entire chain mechanism. The maintenance crews carried spare pots and the tools needed to replace them quickly, working by lantern light to swap out damaged components before the morning shift arrived. The oxen that powered these systems needed their own nighttime care. Fresh straw, clean water, and inspection for any signs of injury or illness that could put them out of commission. A lame ox could shut down a saqiya for days while a replacement was located and trained to work with the specific equipment. The animal handlers developed close relationships with their charges, able to spot subtle changes in behavior that might indicate developing problems. The channels that carried water from the lifting points to the distribution areas required nightly cleaning to remove the sediment and debris that accumulated during daily operations. Small blockages could reduce flow rates significantly, while major clogs could back up the entire system and cause flooding in areas that weren't designed to handle standing water. The aqueduct system had its own team of night watchmen who walked the entire route checking for leaks, structural damage, and signs of tampering or theft. The covered channels were particularly vulnerable to damage from people trying to tap into the system illegally, or from structural settling that could crack the stone lining. The watchmen carried repair materials and could handle minor problems on the spot, but major issues required calling in specialized repair crews. These night shift workers developed their own culture and traditions around the work, with experienced crews training newcomers in the subtle arts of water system maintenance. They knew the sounds that different pieces of equipment made when they were working properly versus when something was beginning to fail. They could tell by the flow patterns in a channel whether there was a partial blockage somewhere upstream, and they knew which problems needed immediate attention versus which ones could wait until the next scheduled maintenance period. The coordination between different maintenance crews was crucial because problems in one part of the system could cascade into major failures elsewhere. The saqiya teams communicated with the aqueduct watchmen about any changes in water levels or flow rates. The Sable maintenance crews reported any unusual patterns in customer demand that might indicate problems with other parts of the distribution network. Record keeping was just as important during the night shift as during the day, with maintenance logs tracking everything from routine cleaning schedules to major repairs and equipment replacements. These records helped managers plan for seasonal maintenance needs, budget for equipment replacement, and identify patterns that might indicate systemic problems requiring design changes. The most skilled night shift workers could diagnose complex problems that might stump daytime operators using their intimate knowledge of how the systems worked under different conditions. They understood that many equipment failures started with subtle changes in performance that were easier to detect during the quiet nighttime hours, when there weren't crowds of customers and daytime distractions masking the early warning signs.